It was on a hot afternoon in Rome, and I know that he was on heart tablets, and for some reason he apparently did not take those pills. He forced this heart attack on himself.
Photographer Erwin Blumenfeld is thought to have deliberately run up and down Rome's Spanish steps in the searing heat.
He didn't want to be taken to hospital, and he gradually seemed to lose his breath. It was almost as if he choked to death, I think. It was clear that this was something he had planned and didn't want to be revived.
It was a suicide, I believe, yes. Because he knew what he was doing and why he was doing it.
After his mysterious death, the man who was once the most highly paid photographer in the world left behind a cache of famously iconic images. The doe eye, the girl on the Eiffel Tower, the girl behind Wet Silk, and Grace Kelly framed in gold.
What makes Erwin Blumenfeld stand out for me as a photographer is his amazing ability to create imagery that when I look at it now, all this time later, like 60 years, 70 years later, I look at it and I go, I wish I'd done that. I wish I'd taken that.
Erwin Blumenfeld's obsession was with beautiful women.
He had a way of expressing desire, and it's amorphous. You know, it's not specific. It's a kind of yearning. You sense this woman obsession behind the pictures. The women seem alive.
But his fetish for beauty led to a complicated private life that would threaten his artistic reputation.
There were various women, there were jealousies, there were rivalries, there were complexities.
The women in Blumenfeld's life failed to work together to curate his legacy. 30,000 negatives, 8,000 black and white prints, and dozens of fashion films. To this day, much of his work has never been seen by the public.
This is the family legacy. Destroy, destruct, separate, and divide.
At the peak of his career, he took hundreds of covers for Harper's Bazaar and Vogue. So what happened to Erwin Blumenfeld?
Blumenfeld's rise to photographic stardom has been meteoric. He has startled the photographic world with his achievements and innovations. In 1935, he was the proprietor of a leather goods store in Amsterdam, and in just 9 years, without benefit of formal instruction, this unknown amateur has become the world's most famous and most highly paid professional photographer. Today, his work leads the field.
In 1941, Erwin Blumenfeld, a German Jew escaping from the Nazis, arrived with his family in New York with one suitcase. Already 44 years old, he had not yet earned a living as a professional photographer. Yet, he would soon be shaping the way America saw itself.
He defined the way that we think of the 40s and 50s. Not necessarily how the 40s and 50s looked, but how we think it looked. And I think that that's what makes him a great photographer, because if you define an age visually for the rest of time, then you've created something amazing.
The USA in the post-war years felt it was on top of the world. And who better to define what it meant to be an American than an émigré, who described himself as un-American forever. He brought an outsider's eye and the sensibility of a European artist.
He's not constrained by his commercial role. There's an absolutely brilliant Vogue cover. He's cut out the shadow underneath a hat to make something which looks like a military beret, and the lipstick is simply a dash of bright purple colour added on to a black and white print. Have a look at something which is as expressive as you can be and still have your art directors allow it to go forward.
Blumenfeld always referred to art directors as arse directors, yet despite his contempt for them, such was his talent that for 20 years they kept coming back for more.
They respond to quality, right? So Blumenfeld consistently delivered. He had a unique voice and vision in his photography that other photographers at his contemporaries didn't have.
Surrounded by the beautiful women he photographed, with a Manhattan apartment and a beach house in the Hamptons, he could hardly believe his luck. Blumenfeld had quite simply reinvented the fashion shoot by understanding it was about creating icons.
This here is arguably not only Blumenfeld's best cover, but one of the most iconic covers in Vogue's history.
It was kind of like the advent of a new age. It was a really important time, and they'd chosen him to take this photograph, and it had a surrealist kind of quality to it, but at the same time, it really was a beauty image. And as a beauty image, it's been sort of ripped off and copied by so many other photographers through time.
I wanted to kind of take that picture, which you've seen so many times, done by so many people in so many different ways, shapes and form, and sort of say, what if that picture came alive? He completely changed the rules of photography, and he opened it up to what it is today for many, many photographers. I think one of the main things that he did for photography that lasts to today is the fact that he took the rule book and he threw it firmly out of the window.
Here's a classic Blumenfeld. I mean, look at all that white space. You'd never see that in a magazine cover now. Very simple headlines and cover lines. Simple image, beautiful use of color. I mean, that's a classic look from him.
Throughout the 40s and 50s, his double-height studio at 222 Central Park South was where he shot and later hand-printed the thousands of covers and advertisements that made his name. It was here that Blumenfeld courted not one, but two cosmetic queens, Elizabeth Arden and Helena Rubinstein. He would shoot campaigns for both of them. Betty Davis posed for him, so did Lucille Ball. By the time Marlene Dietrich met Blumenfeld, her stardom was tarnished. She hoped that having Blumenfeld take her portrait might help her career as it had others. It didn't work. This early image of a 23-year-old Audrey Hepburn was shot in 1952. Grace Kelly came into Blumenfeld's studio the year she filmed To Catch a Thief. Movie stars, singers, society ladies, and top models all wanted to be shot by him.
I use a trick to soften a model's face just before photographing her. I ask her, "Will you marry me?" It's the one formula that makes the American female tick.
But even in his heyday, Blumenfeld was never seduced by fame. His preoccupation was always with what was going on under the surface.
It was multifaceted. Some of it was very, very beautiful, and I guess he was trying to create his perfect woman, his ideal woman in certain times, and some of it was very, very, very dark. If this was a man, it would look really threatening. I mean, this woman looks dangerous, you know, she looks really strong, she's smiling, but her eyes are that of a, you know, a demon tiger or a demon panther, and she looks like you should avoid her at all costs.
He talked about psychological portraiture at one point. He used that phrase. Psychological portraiture was the way of uncovering the reality under the surface. And I think that's what really we have to do with him. It was about women largely. It was an obsession with women. He says several times, I could never really love a single woman. I loved women. I did uncover in my research this amazing negative of him giving birth to a woman. He is in the sort of birthing position, and this mannequin is arriving in the world.
Some of Blumenfeld's most memorable psychological portraits are of himself, a sitter with whom he had the most complex of relationships.
For all his life, he remembered someone telling him as a very young person that he was really ugly, and that upset him. I thought he looked lovely, but that may be my prejudice.
Even today, I remain convinced there is a life in another world going on behind the transparent glass. We are doubles. Without a mirror, I would never have become a human being. Only fools call it a narcissist complex. No mirror, no art, no echo, no music.
It's clear from the self-portraits that he many times photographed himself with masks, with paper bags on his head, with screens in front of his face, with photographic masking if it wasn't physical masking. He often photographed himself. And I have a feeling that there's a lifelong search in the self-portraits to battle out the things that he could not battle out working for commercial clients.
He was dealing with the complexity of his identity in such a vulnerable way. People shy away from that kind of psychological aspect, or did during that period.
Even at the very height of Blumenfeld's career in New York, the demons that haunted him were never far away. Blumenfeld's complexity as an artist can be traced back to his earliest childhood in Berlin.
Whatever the precise details, on 5 May 1896, at the midnight hour, I was unceremoniously thrust into my first concentration camp, doubled up and tethered in solitary confinement for 9 months and condemned to death under the most inhumane living conditions. I began learning how to die.
I think to be a Berlin Jew says a lot of things. Berlin at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century is a melting pot, is like an exuberant place. There's lots of artists, lots of things going on. And being a Jew in Berlin, as the history will show us later in time, is never an easy thing. You're always a marginal, you're always an outsider.
There was always a lot of anti-Semitism, but there was a very big population, Jewish population in Berlin. For instance, the whole cloth trade was in Jewish hands, and as was Erwin Blumenfeld's father, who was an umbrella producer.
He grew up in a middle-class home, where the artistic influences reflected the cultural changes in Berlin at the time.
What drove me to the arts? Sex drove me. I drew my first visual stimulation from Papa's satirical magazines. My autoerotic program was determined by the weekly appearance of the charms of the same demi-mondaines in lace panties. At the same time, I was being prepared for my career in the women's garment trade.
Blumenfeld's fascination with the possibility of photography went back to his childhood years, when, aged 10, a generous uncle gave him his first camera. Aged 13, he would take this self-portrait as Pierrot, using a mirror to obtain both front and profile views.
He would develop his own photographs in the bathroom, and he also used quite a few of his early photographs, very early photographs, in his early collage.
But Blumenfeld's early experiments in photographic collage were interrupted by world events.
Some of these men will stay 4 years in this earth. Many will remain here forever.
At the outbreak of the First World War, Erwin Blumenfeld drove an ambulance for the German army, despite not ever having learned to drive. One of his duties involved keeping a ledger in a field brothel run by the German army. He found the war horrific, but another threat lay much closer to home.
When Erwin Blumenfeld leaked to his mother that he wanted to desert from the army, from war, in 1918, she immediately contacted her brother, who was a German nationalist, and her brother reported him to the police, which could have meant his death. Fortunately, they couldn't find any proof of the fact that he wanted to desert from the army, and so he had to go back to war in the north of France. But she said, better to have a dead child than a traitor.
Before the war was over, Blumenfeld would be awarded an Iron Cross, though not, in his case, for valour.
His company commander wanted to learn French, and my father was able to teach him the fundamentals of the French language, and this is why he got an Iron Cross, which he was very proud of because he thought it was so ridiculous.
Having eventually deserted from the German army without his mother's knowledge, Blumenfeld would be told that his brother and best friend, Heinz, had been killed in battle, aged 19. With the life he had known in Berlin destroyed by war, Blumenfeld found himself drawn to the avant-garde artists who were congregating in the city.
One night, I went in mellow mood to the urinal on Potsdamer Platz. A young dandy came in by the opposite entrance, stood beside me, fixed his monocle in his eye, and in one fell swoop pissed my profile on the wall so masterfully that I could not but cry out in admiration. We became great friends. He was the most brilliant man I ever met in all my life, a great raconteur and an immensely powerful draftsman. It was George Gross.
George Gross was a prominent member of the Berlin Dada group during the Weimar Republic, best known for his savage caricatures of German life in the 1920s. The two were to become fast friends. For many years, these early Dada collages that Blumenfeld made were kept hidden from public view.
He emerged out of that post-First World War moment when Dadaism crystallized, highly politicized, artists, anarchists, they all kind of tend to be one and the same, questioning, challenging what society was, what it should be. He responded to that through his work, which involved photographic collages, reinventing how one might piece together a photograph that was also a political statement.
Looking at the body of collage from 1916 to 1933, I consider them to be very important. You can read his collage a bit like you can read a book. Could be also like a book cover or like a magazine cover. And it's quite extraordinary to think that some of them look like magazine covers, and later on he did these hundreds of covers for Vogue.
I found my new love. He's got the intellect, yes, he's got the mind of a great philosopher or artist, so sure of his place in history. He's a mystery. La da da, la da 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 da.
Blumenfeld continued experimenting with his collage at a time long before photography was even accepted as an art form.
Thinking back to the situation of photography in the 1920s, I think it would probably be true to say that most professional photographers were really glorified tradesmen. It was hardly a profession that attracted somebody of high artistic ambition or with a powerful desire to express themselves.
What I really wanted to be was a photographer, pure and simple, dedicated to his art for art's sake alone. A denizen of the New World, which the American Jew, Man Ray, had triumphantly discovered.
Maybe one day he'll meet me, and I just know that I'll be tongue-tied completely. How could I ever let him know my devotion? It's such a shame. He knows how to do everything but love me.
As a young man, Erwin Blumenfeld felt very alone in the world. He'd begun writing letters to a Dutch girl who was the cousin of a friend. Her name was Lena Citroen. They shared their deepest secrets. By the time the pair finally met in Amsterdam, they were already in love and soon became engaged.
They were extremely close, I think, during those years in a whole range of levels. She was very interested in psychology, and her interest to start reading Freud, and that had a tremendous impact on him. In terms of literature, she was a very literate person, and he was loved reading, and so there was that communion between them at a literary level as well.
In 1920, Erwin Blumenfeld, occasional painter, avid photographer and Dadaist, moved to Amsterdam to be with Lena, who he married. 2 years later, with a baby daughter to feed, he decided to go into business selling handbags. He was now the unlikely proprietor of a leather goods store. A surprise discovery above the store was to change the entire course of Blumenfeld's life.
When he discovered a darkroom on the second floor of the Fox Leather Company, he decided to try to see if he could take pictures of some of the attractive women who came in, and then would put the images in the window shop, and that would attract other women, not only to the leather goods, but also to the photographs. And so pretty soon the photographs are more popular than the leather goods, and that's how things developed. Only gradually did he shift to taking them in more relaxed poses, and eventually he did some nudes as well. And I think my mother didn't mind at all him taking pictures of nude women.
He wasn't just interested in making beautiful pictures of beautiful women. I think he was always trying to get beyond. Those pictures are really quite amazing. They don't date. It's because they're not objectified. It's because obviously he was interested in them as complex social beings. I won't say just women, but as complex social beings.
In Amsterdam, he shot a photograph of a very black man with a very, very white woman.
In 1942, Blumenfeld would shoot the Native American actress Bernu Aquanetta in Life magazine. Later, in 1958, he would photograph Banny Yelverton, the first black model to participate in an American fashion show. He was instructed to place her on the far right of the fold-out, so she could be easily removed or torn out of the magazine by readers who reacted badly to this kind of audacity. In Amsterdam in 1936, Blumenfeld's leather store went out of business, but not before he took one key portrait. The sitter was Geneviève Rouault. Geneviève was a Paris dentist and the daughter of a well-known painter, Georges Rouault. She offered to exhibit Blumenfeld's photographs in her Paris waiting room and promised to introduce him to famous sitters, such as her artist father and his friend, Henri Matisse. Blumenfeld left Holland and took a train to Paris with the aim of becoming a professional photographer. With money lent to Blumenfeld by a family friend, he rented a studio here at 9 Rue de l'Ombre.
When Geneviève Rouault let him have a show in her waiting room, he didn't make any money off of it. Matisse said, you can come to my studio and I'll give you a picture and you give me a picture. And then Matisse chose this portrait that Blumenfeld had taken of him and kept one. And then he said, which one of mine do you like? And Blumenfeld picked some drawing and was thrilled to death. And then Matisse said, yes, I agree, and put it in his drawer. He didn't pay for the portrait, and nobody paid Blumenfeld in those days, but he was making his name as best he could.
And Blumenfeld was finally published. The first editions of Verve magazine showcased 17 groundbreaking photographs by Erwin Blumenfeld.
Double exposures, triple exposures, done in the camera, done in the darkroom, solarizations, high contrast printing. We know he didn't respect rules. He was very proud of saying if the instruction for the new film said never heat it more than above room temperature, he would boil it. If it said never let it go below room temperature, he'd throw it in the freezer. And then you'd get these strange effects on the surface, kind of reticulation and granular structures, sort of liquid feels.
These vintage black and white prints from the 30s are what he considered to be his best work. Many of these are the pictures that he chose for his book, My 100 Best Photographs. In 1938, Blumenfeld's Paris studio received a chance visit from a stranger cloaked in black. Cecil Beaton, the British photographer, had seen Erwin Blumenfeld's early experimental pictures in Verve and was impressed by their originality. He wanted to meet their maker.
Here at last is someone who is not in any way influenced by the work of other photographers. Here is a fresh and clear mind. It seemed to be wrong and disgraceful that his photographs never fetch much money, that with 2 children to support, he should remain so poor. But his merit as an artist lies in the fact that he is incapable of compromise. And though I would like him to work for Vogue, his pictures are not of Vogue quality, for they are much more serious, too provoking, and better than fashion.
But Cecil Beaton did introduce Blumenfeld to Vogue, and in 1939 the magazine was to give him 2 big fashion spreads. Blumenfeld's first.
Paris in the 1920s and 1930s obviously is a very exciting place. No need to go into the theater, the music, the jazz, the art. I mean, it's a really thriving, incredible place to be. For fashion, it's particularly extraordinary and spectacular for many reasons. Obviously, you know, the corsetry has disappeared, women's bodies are now free. There's quite a libertarian point of view where women can express themselves quite differently.
You know, what he was doing really is totally revolutionary, the way you work with the models like that, in the way that the model looks through the camera, the way that they connect with the photographer. It's a unique way of working, and actually sort of says more about him as a person, I think, than just as a photographer. Up till that point, I think most photographers treated, you know, models like, almost like mannequins. You see in his images, they're free.
Working as Vogue's Paris features editor was a young writer named Rosamond Bernier.
Vogue assigned me Blumenfeld. I'd never met him. And they announced bravely, inaccurately, Blumenfeld is rereading Proust for this job. And he roared with laughter. He'd never opened a page of Proust. So I met this very amiable man, and we got along like a house afire. He was such fun. He had a sense of humor. He was totally unpretentious, totally flexible. So we do this, why not? Off we go. So at 6 in the morning, Blumenfeld came to wake me up. And there was no question of taking a suitcase and a nightgown. I was just in my underwear. And so he laughed and took that picture.
Although he spent his days photographing women, Blumenfeld was never afraid to celebrate the sexual ambiguity in himself, as in this self-portrait. It was an urge that spilled over into real life.
I think that he felt attracted to certain men like Cecil Beaton. As he said very proudly, I was always a virgin from the rear end. His rear end was virginal, but other than that he had no particular feelings about I think having oral contacts with various people. There were rumors that he had some kind of relationship with Cary Grant, and as far as I'm concerned, it was all possible.
I think through the first photos he did in Paris in the late 30s, you could really feel an incredible excitement on his behalf already. Finding himself finally in Paris, finally commissioned to do this work, I think was for him already really incredibly exciting, and you could feel that in the pictures. It's kind of like when the sun comes out and just the rays come up and you're almost blinded.
His pictures were daring. I mean, there's no more daring shot, perhaps, that exists in the history of fashion photography than the Go Along the Eiffel Tower. What he did and why he's so important is this enormous breadth of desire and technique and audacity and really, I mean, it's hard to see it now, perhaps in the way it must have been seen at the time, but the cutting edgeness of Erwin Blumenfeld's work at that time must have been fairly incredible.
With money from his first spreads in Vogue, Blumenfeld's wife Lena and their 3 children, Lisette, Henry and Yorick, were able to join Erwin in Paris from Holland. Still desperately poor, the family was happily all together again. It wasn't to last. When the Second World War was declared in 1939, Blumenfeld, a Jew in Paris with a German passport, was all the wrong things in all the wrong places. Fearing what might befall him, on the 4th of September, when war had already broken out, he put all of his photographs, including his glass plates, into 2 huge suitcases and took them to the Dome Cafe. Here, completely by chance, he met a young woman who was pushing a trolley.
He said to her, "Look, do you think you could take my pictures and keep them for me until, you know, things changed. And after the war in 1947, when he went back, he found them and she had kept them all intact.
Within months, all of Blumenfeld's worst nightmares came true. His wife and sons were classified as Dutch and therefore seen as Allied citizens. But Blumenfeld and his daughter Lisette, now 18, despite being Jewish, were both classed as German and sent to 2 different internment camps. Blumenfeld was sent to Le Vernet. In a bizarre twist, although he was interned by the French for being German, these haunting photo montage that Blumenfeld created of Adolf Hitler in the 30s were later dropped over Germany by the Allied forces during the war as anti-German propaganda. Only after Vichy France surrendered to the Germans was Erwin Blumenfeld released and the family finally reunited.
When I first saw my father, I was absolutely horrified because his hair had been shaven off. He looked like a semi-skeleton, and because the food had been terrible, and he hadn't been able to sleep very well there at all. And no, it was really a sort of nightmare experience for him.
We all found each other, we all got together, and for a whole year we waited. My father managed to get visas to the United States, and after 3 months traveling from Marseille to Casablanca, we finally arrived in New York City.
3 days after arriving in Manhattan, Blumenfeld bought a new suit and went to see Carmel Snow, the editor-in-chief of Harper's Bazaar, which was the leading fashion magazine of the day.
Without getting up, without looking up, Blumenfeld, talk of the devil! 2 of one's pages are impossible, and he's gone off on holiday again. We have to have the September issue finalized by tomorrow. Quick, run up to the studio right away and do some fabulous retakes.
When Blumenfeld arrived, he would have found something so different from what was in Europe. It was an exciting time for magazines. It was an exciting time for fashion because for the first time, America was all on its own in producing fashion without French references. There was a sense of possibility.
Among those who Blumenfeld photographed was Carmen dell'Orifice, who is best known today as the world's oldest working supermodel. It was Blumenfeld who first shot her for Vogue and put her on the cover in 1947. They remained friends until he died.
In his studio, he was such an artist. I came in and he made me feel like a guest, like an honored guest, who was so perfect and was doing something so wonderful for him. It just made me feel that I was all right, that I was smart. I didn't know quite what it was that I did, but I could accept his opinion because it was in the smallest gesture of approval as I listened to what Erwin Blumenfeld directed me either to stand or to sit or to move my hand or turn my head. He contained me within the thoughts of the picture he had in his head, that he was creating a painting only with more dimension, with lights, with this huge camera that he was behind with the black cloth over him.
Blumenfeld had a charisma that was undeniable, that was incredible. I mean, women just loved him. They really did. He was seductive without wanting to be. He would come into a room, he'd be the only person there that you would focus on. Everything would stop. And this had to do with some interior power that he had. And a woman who might not be beautiful would be beautiful in his presence if he saw her as beautiful.
In 1947, a woman walked into his studio who was to change his life. Kathleen Levy-Barnett was an extraordinarily glamorous young photo editor and stylist. And she ran Erwin Blumenfeld's studio at 222 Central Park South, transforming his business by securing a lot of commercial work and buying his first colour printer. She was also to become the second great love of his life.
Certainly in the years from the time he was in America to the time he died, certainly his greatest love with Kathleen.
Blumenfeld's 7-year affair with Kathleen was helped by the tolerant attitude of his wife, Lena.
Well, as long as it was in the open and it wasn't a secret thing, and as long as it didn't seem too serious, she thought, you know, this was a great artist's prerogative. I mean, Picasso had women going through revolving doors, and why didn't her husband, who was a great photographer and a great artist, to have the same privilege? And she, I think, had relatively open ideas about extramarital affairs, absolutely, but not, she didn't want my father to leave her.
This is an entry from Lena's diary.
When he tells me things that hurt me, he wants not only to hurt me, but at the same time, he wants my understanding and the feeling that, because of our love for each other, I am part of him. Not as a mother, but as his other half.
With Kathleen now a permanent fixture in the Blumenfeld family, it was only a matter of time before Blumenfeld's middle son, Henry, a physicist, was to strike up a relationship with her. They were later to marry. It was Erwin Blumenfeld who had played matchmaker.
And he was also at other times extremely jealous, but still, he brought us together initially, and he also brought us together at a later date when we had been separated for a while. And yet at the same time, he was very jealous also at other times. So that is complex.
After Kathleen married Henry, Erwin's understanding wife Lena came to accept her and settled into the role of grandmother to Kathleen and Henry's 2 children.
Well, she was, I think, also very jealous of Kathleen, but as long as Kathleen wasn't going to marry him or run away with him, I think that she was relieved not to lose my father.
But there was one person in the family who would never accept Kathleen. Erwin's very first photographic muse, his daughter Lisette.
My mother told me about a picture of Kathleen standing in between Henry, who she had married, and Blumenfeld, whom she had loved. And my mother thought it was disgusting that they both looked the same, and then there was Kathleen in the middle.
This animosity between family members would come back to haunt Blumenfeld from beyond the grave. But during his lifetime, the main tension was not between Kathleen and Erwin's beloved daughter Lisette. From the time that he moved to New York, the real conflict was between art and commerce, between the work he did for money and the pictures he took in the pursuit of beauty.
All photographers have to earn a living, so he went where the money was, and we know that he felt a little badly about that. At one point, he suggested to Yorick, that his son, that he had prostituted himself. And it's interesting that several times in his autobiography he talks about prostitution. I think it's kind of interesting. He seems to be suggesting that prostitution is not so much just about him, but rather a kind of temptation and a widespread part of the human condition. I think we could go that far. So Blumenfeld, the photographer, Blumenfeld, the artist, is a much more interesting subject than Blumenfeld, the fashion photographer.
In the 1960s, Blumenfeld, the commercial artist, was to embark on an exciting new adventure as the director of the world's first fashion films.
The latter part of his career, with certain of his clients, he suggested to them that a fashion and beauty imagery could be seen in movement just as beautifully as it could be seen as a still image. And this fact is probably one of the most important facts and one of the most relevant today. He was talking about how he was taking his beautiful imagery onto television, and that could be a revolution in how you communicated. So these little films were really ahead of their time and stand up very well artistically if you look at them now. The beauty that he put in his still images is very coherent and very dominant in his films.
His other risky late-life adventure was with a 22-year-old Swiss girl named Marina Schintz, who worked with him as an assistant from 1961.
Her father was a famous radiologist in Switzerland, and he was so famous that the Führer came to him to be examined when he had some kind of cancerous problem, and Herr Schintz was the Führer's chosen doctor. And
was that spoken of?
Yes, and Blumenfeld, being a Jew from Berlin, was obsessed with Hitler from the very beginning.
Eventually, they became lovers, and when my mother then was in Vienna in the hospital sick, I think only then did the Marina come to stay with my father. My mother did know all about what was going on.
When his wife, Lena, was with us in Vienna and she was in hospital and she was really suffering, he came over to see her, and there was an immensely emotional scene in the hospital where Erwin was crying and they were holding each other, and it was so tender and loving that I could hardly stay in the same room.
But even Lena's tolerance had its limits, as she wrote to him in 1967.
Neither the beautiful memories of our past, nor the wonderful children and grandchildren we have together, have helped us to live together in harmony. Neither can I suffer any longer this way. That's why I must finally agree that it might be better if you marry M. But you don't want me to be part of this any longer, as I was before, because you don't want to be old with me. You want to be young with M.
In his last relationship with Marina, he wanted to explain it to us, and because we didn't really understand what his attraction was or what the relationship was. And we never forget, we were sitting in a cafe in Paris, and there was a mirror behind him, And he said, when I sit here, and someday you'll understand this, when I sit here looking at my image, as it gets older, every minute I'm looking at it, it's horrifying. But if I can be with a young woman and I look in her eyes and I see an image of myself as a young man, I feel re-energized, rejuvenated, and I feel I'm escaping the inevitable. And I think that that was incredibly honest of him. He was very afraid of becoming old.
It wasn't only intimations of his own mortality that threatened Blumenfeld. The magazine world too was changing before his eyes.
I think at one time he was regarded as one of the leading photographers in America. And then a new generation came in, and he was already seen as the old generation.
Fashion runs in cycles, always has. It doesn't take long before things fall out of fashion. I mean, that's one certainty in fashion, right? If you don't like what you see, just wait 6 months and it'll all change. The magazine just changed. I mean, culture changed, what they're reporting on changed, the clothes changed, and the new photographers came in.
This was a new experience for Blumenfeld, who had been lionized virtually from the day he entered the New York fashion world. But the 60s revolution in taste and style had run ahead of him, and suddenly he had nowhere to go. The summer of 1969 found him in Rome in the company of Marina Schintz.
We were giving a 4th of July party. I got this telephone call from Marina that he had died.
Now, I think it was clear from the phone call from Marina that Erwin had decided to end his life rather than simply died, that he had run down these Spanish steps and run back up them, and when he got to the room and he hadn't been taking his heart medicine, I think it was quite clear from that phone call that it had happened in that way.
He forced this heart attack on himself, thinking that he had prostate problems, perhaps cancer, but in any case, he did not want to have an operation, or he didn't want to die suffering and going through prolonged death. He wanted death.
That the 72-year-old Erwin Blumenfeld would kill himself was shocking enough to his family. But what happened next resulted in decades of dispute.
The people he was most closely involved with, whether it was his children, his daughter Lisette, his wife, Kathleen, Marina, they all felt they all felt possessively about him. They all wanted to claim a part of him. And I think that led to enormous animosity when he died.
After the burial, it was revealed that he had left the management of his photographic estate to his mistress, Marina. She was to prove a reluctant champion.
I guess if Marina would have pushed the prince, but you know, Marina had a life and wanted to move on and didn't want to be really known as, I mean, maybe she didn't want her early life to be exposed that way.
How do you mean?
Well, being his girlfriend. She was 22 and he was 65. For a photographer's reputation to survive, you have to have left a champion. That's how you survive after death as a photographer.
For the first 20 years about Marina, she tried to do a little, perhaps not too much, but at least she put things in proper boxes and so on. She divided up the pictures and forgave 1/4 to each child and kept 1/4 for herself.
Too many people, including some of the women in his life, felt that they had an entitlement to a section of that life and the story of his career. So it became a kind of tug of war between various personalities.
You can't bring a body of work together when the motivating forces behind the factions are jealousy, hatred, and destruction, and self-interested power and glory and control.
It's been left to the grandchildren to put the past behind. They are cooperating, making thousands of prints left by Blumenfeld available to a wider public. These photographs, taken at his studio at 222 Central Park South and published around the world in the 40s and 50s, are finally being exhibited for the very first time, thanks in particular to his granddaughter Nadia.
I put a lot of work into this to get them to a better condition, to be recognized, to be shown to the world, and not wait for the rest of the family to say yes or no to this. And so I think that in time his name will come up for the future as one of the great photographers of the 20th century.
Museums are also at last opening their doors to Blumenfeld, with big shows at the Louvre in Paris, Somerset House in London, and the Metropolitan Museum of Photography here in Tokyo. And as new generations are learning about Blumenfeld's work, the man who shot to fame photographing beautiful women is starting to be remembered as the richly complex artist he always was.
And I think that we have to really perhaps begin to see the fuller picture again and deal with the complexity of this individual and understand how ahead of his time, how avant-garde he was, and how willing he was to examine himself as an artist and be open to all of these mediums.
If you look at his work, it's been copied by pretty much every photographer that's worked in the kind of the art nudes sort of fashion beauty world. In one way or another, we've all drawn inspiration, whether you've known it or not.
I think it's important to see him as as a great photographer. If we want to say he's a great fashion photographer, he was. And he did things in fashion that set the trends for years to come.
What makes it so timeless is the fact that the beauty is still as beautiful today as it was 70 years ago. He was able to define beauty and the woman of the 20th century.
I've spent my whole life letting off suicidal steam, which some might call vitality. To date, everyone has had to die. Yet, immortality is just around the corner. It's every man for himself. Will I manage to shuffle off this mortal coil?